Berlin was a corpse of a city, and they were the insects picking through its bones. The grand, choking silence after the artillery barrage was the loudest sound Senior Sergeant Semyon Steinberg had ever heard. It was a vacuum, pulling at his eardrums, filled only by the trickle of dislodged plaster, the groan of a shifting beam, and the rhythmic, metallic crunch of his squad's boots on the shattered mosaic of brick and glass. He led them, not with words, but with the precise, predatory language of his body. A raised fist, halt. A flat cutting gesture, clear that room. A slow, pointed nod, move forward. His men, a mix of grizzled veterans and wide-eyed replacements, mirrored his silence. They had learned that his stillness in the eye of the storm was more reliable than any shouted command. His face was a topography of exhaustion carved in stone and soot. But his eyes were black, burning coals, scanning every shadowed aperture, every jagged silhouette. They missed nothing. They gave away less. The building they entered had once been stately. A marble staircase now lay in a chaotic avalanche of white fragments. A crystal chandelier rested in a glittering, pathetic heap atop an overturned grand piano. The air stank of damp plaster, burnt wood, and the underlying sweet putrid scent of death that no spring breeze could yet erase. They moved room by ruined room. A parlor with floral wallpaper peeling like dead skin, a library where thousands of pages swirled in a lazy gray snow. The tension was a wire pulled taut in Semyon's gut. This was the worst kind of fighting. Not the open field, but this intimate, claustrophobic hunt where death waited behind every door. It waited in the kitchen. Private Yevgeny, the youngest, pushed the splintered door inward. For a second there was only the sight of shattered china and a cold, black stove. Then, movement. A blur of field gray launched from a pantry nook. Not a soldier. A boy. A German conscript with a face still soft with youth, twisted now into a primal scream of terror. He held not a rifle, but a sharpened entrenching shovel, swinging it in a wild, scything arc. Time did not slow. It fractured. Semyon's body reacted before his mind could register the face. He sidestepped the blow, the wind of it rustling his tunic. His left hand shot out, a vice clamping on the boy's wrist, bending it back with a brutal, efficient torque. The shovel clattered. The German gasped, his blue eyes, wide with animal panic, locking onto Semyon's. In that split second, Semyon did not see an enemy. He saw a child, a terrified, conscripted child. And in that instant the world tore open. The grimy kitchen walls dissolved into the stark, endless mud of a roll call square. The German's blue eyes multiplied into 100, 1,000 other blue and gray and cold eyes, set in cleaner, crueler faces, framed by the sharp peaks of SS caps. The silence was ripped apart by a memory of sound. Not the boom of shells, but the sharp, percussive bark of guard dogs, the sickening crack of a truncheon on bone, a symphony of shouted commands and muffled sobs. The smell of death was no longer vague. It was the specific, greasy stench of smoke from tall chimneys, searing his nostrils. The shock was a physical blow to his solar plexus. It lasted less than a heartbeat. His right hand was already moving. His combat knife, its blade dull and utilitarian, flashed dully in the gray light. There was no anger in the motion, no hatred. It was a grim, mechanical conclusion. He drove the blade up, under the rib cage, a surgeon performing a fatal, familiar operation. The German boy's breath exploded from him in a hot, wet rush against Semyon's neck. The terror in his eyes melted into blank, surprised emptiness. His body sagged, its full, dead weight suddenly hanging from Semyon's grip. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. Semyon held him for a second longer, the warmth of the boy's blood seeping through his uniform sleeve, hot and intimate. His own hand, the one that held the knife, began to tremble. A fine, uncontrollable vibration that traveled up his wrist. He stared at it, a detached part of his brain observing this betrayal of his own flesh. He released the body, letting it slide to the dirty floor with a soft, final thud. The squad flooded in, weapons raised, but the room was still. They saw their sergeant standing over another dead German. Nothing new. Yevgeny looked pale, swallowing hard. Semyon knelt, not to search. He placed his left hand, the one that was steady, over the boy's face, closing the sightless blue eyes with his thumb. The gesture was not one of mercy, but of ceremony, a necessary punctuation mark to end the sentence of that shared, horrific moment. As he stood, he wiped his knife clean on the boy's tunic, the motion slow and thorough. The tremor in his right hand was gone, forcefully suppressed, locked away. Hours later, in the damp, candle-lit cellar, serving as their platoon's command post, the atmosphere was different. The palpable fear had given way to a weary, fragile levity. A bottle of looted schnapps made the rounds. Men spoke of home, of women, of the rumor that the war, the real war, was finally over up top. Semyon sat apart in a corner where the brick wall was cold against his back. The sounds of his comrades were a distant murmur, a radio playing in another room. He unslung his map case, the leather worn soft as skin. His fingers, precise and deliberate, found not maps, but a hidden seam inside the lining. He picked at the threads with a hardened fingernail, his movements slow, ritualistic. From the hidden pocket, he withdrew 2 objects. The first was a photograph. It was small, its corners worn to a fuzzy roundness. The image was faded, bleached by time and sweat, but still discernible. A man with a scholar's gentle eyes behind round spectacles, a woman with a serene smile and a beautiful old-fashioned braid crowning her head, and between them a boy of about 13. The boy was trying to look solemn for the camera, but a spark of impatient life flickered in his gaze. On the white border at the bottom, in elegant, cursive script, was written, "For our Solomon, to your 13th year, May 1939. Semyon's thumb, rough and scarred, traced the outline of the boy's face. He did not smile. His breathing remained even, but the muscle in his jaw tightened, a small, telltale ripple under the skin. Then, he placed the photograph on his knee and removed the second object. It was a small, rectangular tag made of thin, cheap metal. It was stamped with a sequence of numbers, 124565. The metal was not rusty, but worn unnaturally smooth and shiny along its edges and around the punched holes, polished by years of relentless, abrasive contact with skin and cloth. He held the tag in his palm. It was cold, heavier than its size suggested. Without looking, his other hand came up. His fingers pushed back the grimy cuff of his uniform tunic, then the soiled sleeve of his undershirt. There, on the pale skin of his inner left wrist, was not a scar, but a permanent, indented groove. A faint, gray line of calloused skin, shaped exactly like the edges of the metal tag. Slowly, deliberately, he fitted the cold metal back into its ghostly imprint on his living flesh. A perfect match. The physical shock of that contact, the coldness meeting the memory of constant chafing, was like closing an electrical circuit. His eyes lifted from his wrist, staring unseeingly at the cellar wall. The laughter of his men finally faded from his awareness completely. In his mind, there was no Berlin cellar. There was only the vast, crushing silence of the Appellplatz after a selection, the hollow feeling in his stomach, and the weight of the number that was not a name. He was here, Senior Sergeant Semyon Steinberg, decorated soldier. And he was there, prisoner 124565, the boy Solomon from the photograph. The two realities collided in the dark space behind his eyes, held together only by the cold piece of metal pressing into the scar on his wrist. The war outside might be ending. But his war, the silent one he carried in his flesh and bones, had just violently, unmistakably announced it was still very much alive. The order came at dawn, carried by a lieutenant whose uniform was still suspiciously crisp. It spoke of a warehouse on the city's industrial fringe, suspected of holding Nazi archives or perhaps a last cache of weapons. A squad was to investigate and secure. Semyon's squad drew the duty. The journey was a descent into a different layer of ruin. The shattered city center gave way to a landscape of industrial carcasses, twisted steel gantries like the ribs of colossal beasts, the hollow shells of factories with their windows blown into sightless black eyes. The silence here was not peaceful, but ominous, a held breath. As they approached the coordinates, the smell hit them first. It cut through the usual sense of fire and decay. It was a thick, cloying, sweet, rotten odor, mixed with the pungent bite of unwashed humanity and the sharp, chemical reek of lie. It was a smell Semyon knew. His body knew it before his mind could articulate the memory. The fine hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His pace did not falter, but his breathing became shallower, a subconscious defense against the invisible assault. The warehouse was a sprawling, low-slung brick building adjacent to a railway siding. Its doors were massive, wooden, and hung ajar on broken hinges. But it was not the building that held their attention. It was the fence, a perimeter of rusted barbed wire, hastily erected and sagging in places, enclosed a muddy field beside the structure. And within that field, people. Not soldiers, not Berliners. A crowd of human shapes, wrapped in rags, striped uniforms so faded they looked gray, and odd assemblages of civilian clothes that hung from skeletal frames. They moved slowly, listlessly, or sat huddled in groups on the bare, damp earth. Their eyes tracked the approaching soldiers, not with hope, not with fear, but with a flat, exhausted vacancy. This was no weapons cache. This was a lager, a camp. A young private named Petya, who had celebrated his 19th birthday with that bottle of schnapps, instinctively raised his rifle. Semyon's hand shot out, pressing the barrel down with a force that was almost violent. "No," he said, the single word a low growl that brooked no argument. He looked at his men, his black eyes sweeping over their confused, wary faces. "They are not the enemy." The lieutenant, looking suddenly uncertain, ordered them to secure the perimeter. Semyon took point, walking toward the main gate, a gap in the wire where 2 SS guards had probably stood days before. The people inside shrank back as he approached, a collective flinch. He stopped at the boundary, not entering. He just stood, taking it in. The camp was a snapshot of hell in its final administrative phase. There were no gas chambers here, no crematoria. This was a transit point, a dumping ground, perhaps for foreign workers, Osterbeiter, perhaps for prisoners evacuated from the east marched here to die in the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Makeshift latrine trenches fouled the air. A single water pump stood in the center, a slow brown drip falling from its spout. Then he heard it. A woman's voice, cracked and desperate, murmuring in Polish. Czy jest woda? Czy kto? Ma wod? Is there water? Does anyone have water? The language was a key, turning in a lock deep inside him. It was the language of the market in his hometown, the language his mother used with her sisters. The sound bypassed his brain and went straight to his core. The icy, controlled shell he had maintained since Berlin cracked with an almost audible tension. He moved then, not as a soldier, but as a man compelled. He unslung his canteen and walked toward the voice, ignoring the protocol, ignoring his lieutenant's shout of caution. The people parted for him, a sea of hollow faces. The woman was young, or had been once. Her hair was matted, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets. She held the hand of a small child who did not cry, who simply stared with ancient, dull eyes. Semyon knelt, the mud soaking through his trousers. He held out the canteen. She stared at it, then at him, distrust, and a flicker of animal need warring in her gaze. He unscrewed the cap, took a small sip himself to show it was safe, then offered it again. She snatched it, her movements jerky, and gave it to the child first, whispering. As the child drank, Semyon's eyes swept the faces around him, the striped uniforms, the shaved heads on some of the men, the particular way they held their bodies, a posture of perpetual submission, of making oneself small. He knew this posture. His own spine remembered it. A cold nausea, distinct from fear, rose in his throat. The lieutenant was barking orders to bring up their limited field rations, to try and organize some semblance of aid. Chaos ensued, well-meaning but clumsy. Semyon became an anchor. He spoke to the woman in Polish, his own tongue stumbling over words he hadn't used in years, asking how many were sick, where they had come from. He translated for his baffled comrades. He says they were in a factory near Leipzig. The guards left 3 days ago. They have had no food. His voice was calm, practical, but underneath it ran a current of something dark and furious. He moved through the camp, his presence strangely calming. He did not offer hollow comfort. He pointed Petya to a group of men who could help distribute the hardtack. He sent another soldier to see if the warehouse held any usable supplies. His efficiency was a stark contrast to the surrounding despair. Night fell, a chilly, clear blanket over the misery. A small fire was lit outside the wire for the soldiers. The prisoners huddled in the dark of the open field or the cold warehouse. Semyon sat by the fire, but he was not with his men. He stared into the flames, his face a mask carved from the surrounding shadows. Petya, emboldened by the day's shared horror, sat beside him, silent for a long time. Finally he spoke, his voice hushed. "Sergeant, how did you know? Their language. What to do?" Semyon did not look at him. He continued to watch the fire eat a piece of wood. The flames reflected in his eyes, dancing in the dark pools. Minutes passed. He reached slowly into his tunic, not for the hidden pocket this time, but into a breast pocket. He pulled out the metal tag. He didn't show the number. He just held it in his palm, letting the firelight glint dully off the worn surface. "I knew," he said, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Because I wore one of these. Not this one, but like it." He paused, the words feeling like stones he had to dislodge from his chest. "In a place? A special camp. They did not call us by names there, only numbers. Petya stared, his young face pale. A camp? You were a prisoner? Semyon's jaw tightened. He gave a single sharp nod. There, in that place. I was not Semyon. He closed his fist around the tag, the metal biting into his palm. My name was a number, and before that, before the war, before the number. He looked up, past the fire, into the vast, starry sky over the German fields. My name was Solomon. 3 days after the camp, the front was a concept, not a line. It had dissolved into 1,000 scattered pockets of resistance, surrender, and chaotic flight. The squad was attached to a motorized rifle company, their mission now to comb through the pine forests and small lakes southwest of Berlin. Intelligence, gleaned from frightened burgomasters and surrendered Wehrmacht soldiers, spoke of SS fanatics refusing the end, planning a last stand, or a guerrilla war from the woods, the so-called werewolf. The forest was a cathedral of oppressive green and dappled, deceptive light. The roar of engines felt like a blasphemy here. The trucks rumbled along a dirt track, the soldiers in the back tense and silent, scanning the wall of trees. Semyon sat with his back against the cab, feeling every jolt of the suspension. The memory of the camp, the smell, the feel of the number tag in his hand, was a fresh wound under his skin. It had reawakened ghosts that now walked beside him, their silent footsteps matching the crunch of the truck's tires. They reached a designated clearing, a hunter's lodge commandeered as a temporary command post. The air was crisp, smelling of pine resin and damp earth. The orders were simple and brutal. A reported platoon-strength group of SS had been spotted near a forester's house 2 kilometers east. They were to be encircled and captured or neutralized. The move out was a study in controlled tension. The forest swallowed them whole, the sounds of their movement, the rustle of uniforms against bracken, the muted clink of gear, seeming deafening in the primeval quiet. Semyon led his men not down paths, but through the thickest undergrowth, using the terrain as cover. His senses were hyper-alert. Every bird call was analyzed, every snapped twig mapped. The forest was no longer just a tactical problem. It felt like a territory of the hunted, and he knew that role intimately. They found the forester's house, a low, timber-framed building nestled against a slope. Smoke curled thinly from its chimney. Too obvious. A trap or stupidity? The lieutenant signaled, and the squads fanned out, a noose of men in steel tightening silently through the trees. The first shot was a shocking violation of the silence. It came from a machine gun nest they had missed, camouflaged in a pile of logs. Bark exploded from trees. A soldier to Semyon's left cried out and went down. Instantly, the calm shattered into a storm of noise and violence. The Soviets returned fire, the staccato racket of PPSH-41s shredding the air. Grenades thumped, sending geysers of dirt and pine needles skyward. Semyon's world narrowed to a tunnel. He motioned 2 men to flank the machine gun, his gestures sharp and clear even as bullets whined past. He provided covering fire, short, controlled bursts that chipped wood from the log pile. There was no fear in him, only a cold, calculating fury. This was a language he understood. Action, reaction, survival. The firefight was short and vicious. The SS group, perhaps 20 men, was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Soviet encirclement was too tight. A white rag, grimy and hesitant, appeared from a window of the house. Then another. The shooting sputtered and died, leaving an aching silence filled with the moans of the wounded and the sharp, acrid smell of cordite that overpowered the pine. The order came to secure the prisoners. They emerged from the house and the surrounding foxholes with their hands high or clasped behind their heads. Young men, mostly, some defiant, jaws set, eyes burning with hate. Others were hollowed out by terror, boys playing at being soldiers, until the real end arrived. Soviet soldiers moved among them, roughly disarming them, pushing them into a ragged line in the clearing. Semyon's job was to oversee, to catalog. He moved down the line with a notebook in his hand, his face the usual mask of detached efficiency. He noted insignia, ranks, any identifying marks. His gaze was impersonal, a scanner processing data. Unterstrumpf, Herr, Oberscharf, Herr, Sturmen. The black uniforms were dirty, torn, stripped of their mythical terror in the muddy light of the forest. He reached the end of the line. The last prisoner stood slightly apart, as if his own men had subconsciously distanced themselves from him. He was older than the others, perhaps in his early 40s. His SS uniform, though stained, was of better quality, his officer's cap still perched at a precise, arrogant angle on his head. He held himself unnaturally straight, his hands clasped behind his head, not in surrender, but as if posing for a disagreeable portrait. His face was lean, intelligent, with sharp cheekbones and thin, bloodless lips pressed into a line of contempt. But it was his eyes that registered first, a pale, cold blue-gray, like chips of winter ice. They did not dart around in fear. They stared straight ahead, over the heads of his captors, seeing nothing, acknowledging nothing. Semyon stopped. The notebook in his hand became irrelevant. The sounds of the forest, the moaning, the shouted commands, the rustle of the wind in the pines, all receded into a dull, roaring hum, as if he had been plunged underwater. His eyes locked onto that face. Time did not just slow, it fractured, rewound, and projected a ghost image directly over the man before him. The crisp SS cap morphed into the familiar, dreaded peak. The forest clearing dissolved into the gray, endless mud of the roll call square in Auschwitz. The arrogant tilt of the chin was the same. The cold, dismissive gaze was the same. It was a gaze that had swept over lines of skeletal men, not as human beings, but as inventory, as problems to be solved. A name, not a rank, detonated in Semyon's mind. Der Fuchs, the fox. The memory was not a vague feeling, it was a sensory avalanche. The smell of the man's leather gear, polished and distinct amid the camp's stench. The sound of his voice, cultured, almost pleasant, a professor's voice discussing poetry, asking his father about Hegel and Kant in fluent, mocking Polish, before nodding to the guard to take him away. The particular way he would tap his polished boot against the ground when he was impatient, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Semyon's blood turned to ice, then to fire. A visceral, physical shock traveled up his spine, a jolt so powerful he felt his fingers twitch, threatening to drop the notebook. His lungs seized. He could not draw breath. The world tilted on its axis. The prisoner, feeling the intensity of the stare, finally deigned to look down. His icy eyes met Semyon's. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing but the blank arrogance of a captured officer facing an inferior. Then, something flickered. A micro-expression. A tiny tightening around the eyes. A minuscule, involuntary twitch at the corner of the thin mouth. It wasn't recognition. It was a primal animal signal of unease, as if he had seen a ghost from a past he had meticulously buried. He quickly looked away, resuming his gaze into the middle distance. But the connection had been made. The circuit was closed. Senior Sergeant Semyon Steinberg stood frozen in the dappled forest light, the list of prisoners forgotten in his hand. Before him, breathing the same air, stood SS Unterscharf, Harrer, Karl Richter. And behind the uniform, behind the prisoner of war status, behind 6 years and a universe of suffering, stood the fox. The man who had sentenced his father to a philosophical debate, and then to the gas. The man whose face had haunted the darkest corners of his memory, sharper and more real than any other. The hunt, it seemed, was over, and a new, more terrible one had just begun in the silence of Semyon's soul. The forest around him ceased to exist. There were only 2 men in the world, linked by an invisible thread of ash and memory. The return to the temporary camp was a blur conducted in a state of profound sensory detachment for Semyon. The prisoners were herded onto trucks, their hands bound. The wounded were loaded separately. Semyon moved through the procedures with an automaton's precision, his body performing the duties of a sergeant, while his mind existed in a separate, icy chamber. His eyes never left the back of the older SS man's head. He noted the way the prisoner, Karl Richter, moved, not with the defeated slump of the others, but with a stiff, controlled economy, as if he were still reviewing troops. Each detail, the set of his shoulders, the precise part in his graying hair, was a piece of damning evidence being catalogued in a courtroom Semyon held in his skull. The makeshift camp was a repurposed Hitler Youth hostel on the edge of the forest. It now buzzed with the grim business of processing the collapse of an empire. Prisoners were funneled into a large bare hall that had once echoed with patriotic songs. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, damp wool, and the sharp, clean scent of Soviet disinfectant. Typewriters clacked in an adjoining room as NKVD officers began the work of sorting the guilty from the merely conscripted. Semyon stood near the doorway, a statue of watchful stillness. The initial processing was chaotic. Names were taken, personal effects confiscated. Richter stood in line, his posture still defiantly erect. When a young, harried Soviet clerk gestured for him to empty his pockets, Richter did so with a slow, deliberate contempt, placing a wallet, a fountain pen, and a small, elegant notebook on the table. The clerk, annoyed, swept the items into a canvas bag. Richter's gaze followed the notebook for a moment, a flicker of something, irritation, concern, breaking through his mask before it reset into icy neutrality. That notebook. It was a trigger. In Semyon's memory, the fox always carried one. He would stand at the edge of the Appellplatz, making small notations, his head tilted in thought. The sight of it, that tool of cold bureaucracy, was the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place, with a soundless mental crack. Without a word, Semyon turned and walked down a dim, tiled corridor that led to the basement rooms used for interrogations. He moved with a purpose that brooked no interruption. He entered a small, cold room containing only a table, 2 chairs, and a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. He took a blank form from a stack on a shelf, the paper coarse and utilitarian. He did not sit. He stood behind the chair meant for the interrogator, his knuckles white where they gripped the wooden back. Minutes later, the door opened. A young private escorted Richter in. The prisoner's hands were bound in front of him. He glanced around the room, his expression one of bored disdain, as if assessing substandard accommodations. The private pushed him into the chair facing the table and left, closing the door with a solid thud. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Richter sat, waiting, his bound hands resting on the table. Semyon remained standing in the shadows behind the other chair, letting the silence stretch, letting the prisoner feel the weight of the empty space. Finally, Semyon moved. Not to sit, but to circle the table slowly, his boots making no sound on the concrete floor. He stopped behind Richter, just outside his peripheral vision. He could smell him now, the stale sweat, the hint of forest mold on his uniform, and underneath, the faint, lingering scent of good pre-war cologne, a ghost of his old authority. Semyon's voice, when it came, was not the sergeant's bark. It was low, flat, and conversational, spoken in flawless, unaccented German. It held no emotion. It was simply a statement of fact. The November rain in Auschwitz had a particular quality, Semyon said, his gaze fixed on the damp patch on the far wall. It was not a cleanser, it was a mixer. It churned the mud of the Appellplatz into a thick, gray paste, and it combined the smell of the pine forests from the east with the smell from the chimneys in the west. It created a new smell, a unique smell, one you never forget. Richter did not move, but Semyon saw the minute stiffening of the tendons in the back of his neck. His bound hands, resting on the table, remained still, but the fingertips pressed just a fraction more firmly against the wood. Semyon continued, circling slowly to the front of the table now, though he remained standing, looming over the seated man. He still did not look directly at him, speaking as if to the air. The guards hated it. The mud ruined their polished boots. But some of the officers, they didn't seem to mind. They would stand under the eaves of the administration block, watching, as if observing a fascinating, if unpleasant, natural phenomenon. He placed his palms flat on the table and leaned forward, finally bringing his face into the cone of light from the bare bulb. His eyes, dark and fathomless, locked onto Richter's pale ones. You were one of those officers, Unterscharf, Herr. You had a particular spot, by the corner window of Blockführerstube. You would stand there, sometimes with a cigarette, sometimes just watching. And when you were bored of watching the rain, you would find other amusements. Richter's face was a master class in controlled denial. His lips thinned. I do not know what you are talking about. I served on the Eastern Front, with the Wicking Division. I have never been to this place you describe. Semyon did not react to the lie. He pushed off from the table and began pacing again, a predator circling. His voice remained that same, unnervingly calm monotone. You had a nickname among the prisoners. They called you Der Fuchs, the fox. Not for your cunning, for your manner, the way you would listen. You had a pretense of intellect. You enjoyed conversations, particularly with the educated ones, the doctors, the teachers, the philosophers. He stopped pacing abruptly and turned. His next words were not in German. They were in precise, scholarly Polish, the language of the universities. They were the exact words, spoken in the same cadence Semyon had heard 6 years ago, seared into his memory with a white-hot brand. Pan Professor, if Hegel's world spirit is manifest in history, what historical role do you suppose is being fulfilled here, in this place? Is this the dialectical negation of your people, the necessary antithesis? The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for Richter's composure. His head jerked back as if struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. His icy eyes widened, not with fear yet, but with utter disbelieving shock. The mask of the frontline soldier shattered. Here was not a generic accusation. Here was a specific verbatim quote from a specific moment, delivered in the exact language he had used. It was an impossibility. A ghost speaking from a grave, he was certain was sealed. He tried to recover, his voice losing its steadiness, becoming a harsh whisper. This is a trick, a fabrication. You have been fed lies by partisans. Semyon took a single slow step closer. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from Richter's. He could see the tiny broken capillaries in the man's eyes, the faint stubble on his chin. He could smell the sour breath of panic now, overriding the cologne. In a voice so low it was almost inaudible, a voice that carried the absolute, terrible weight of truth, Semyon delivered the final blow. His name was David Steinberg. He was a professor of philosophy from Krakow UMW. He answered your question about Hegel for 20 minutes. You listened. You nodded. You seemed interested. When he finished, you thanked him for the enlightening discussion. Semyon paused, letting the memory of his father's tired, hopeful face hang in the air between them. Then you turned to the capo and said, "This one is too clever for this work. Put him on the list for the next transport." You tapped your boot twice on the ground. Tap, tap, just like that. At the mention of the boot taps, Richter flinched, a full-body tremor he could not suppress. His eyes darted wildly, not seeing the room but the past, the muddy square, the gaunt professor, his own polished boot tapping on the wooden step. The specific, intimate detail was the kill shot. This was no fabrication. This was a witness. The arrogant prisoner was gone. In his chair sat a cornered animal. His arrogance had been replaced by a raw, primal fear. The fear of a man who realizes the ledger of his life has just been opened by the one person who can read every entry. He looked at Semyon not as a Soviet sergeant, but as an avenging phantom, a walking, breathing indictment of his entire existence. Semyon straightened up. He looked down at the shattered man, his own face expressionless. He had not touched him. He had not raised his voice. His interrogation needed no fists, no tools. His weapons were memory, a perfect, painful memory, and he had just fired them all. Without another word, Semyon turned and walked to the door. He opened it, the bright light from the corridor flooding into the dim room, framing his silhouette. He paused on the threshold, not looking back. He had said all he needed to say. He left Karl Richter sitting alone in the stark electric light. Drowning in the silence Semyon had filled with the echoing ghosts of his own crimes. The door closed with a soft, definitive click, leaving the fox alone with the hounds of his past, baying at last in his ears. The corridor outside the interrogation room was a tunnel of echoing noise and harsh electric light, a brutal return to the mundane world. For Semyon, stepping out of that silent, charged cell was like breaching the surface of a deep, black ocean. The sounds, the clatter of typewriters, the gruff commands of guards, the murmur of prisoners in the hall, hit him as a physical wave, dissonant and overwhelming. He walked, but his body felt disconnected, operating on a set of pre-programmed instructions. His hand reached out, found the cold, damp wall of the corridor, and the solidity of the brick against his palm was the only thing convincing him he was still real, still anchored to the earth. He did not return to the main hall. He moved on instinct, away from the noise, through a side door that led outside into the encroaching twilight. The air was cool and clean, smelling of wet grass and distant wood smoke, a violent contrast to the claustrophobic stench of memory and fear he had just left behind. He leaned against the rough brick of the building's exterior, his head tilted back, and drew in a long, shuddering breath that felt like his first in 6 years. Inside him, a silent cataclysm was unfolding. The icy, controlled shell he had cultivated for survival was gone, shattered by the direct hit of facing Richter. In its place was a raw, white-hot maelstrom. It was not a single emotion, but a warring constellation of them, a searing, righteous fury that demanded a physical, immediate answer, a profound, hollow grief that was older than the war, a bottomless pit that had just been violently reopened, and threading through it all, a cold, meticulous clarity that was the most terrifying part of all. It was the clarity of a mathematician presented with a final, elegant equation. The variables were known. The solution was obvious: revenge. It presented itself not as a passionate urge, but as a logical, even inevitable, conclusion. A restoration of balance. An eye for an eye, a life for a life, a father for a fox. The geometry was perfect in its simplicity. He saw it with terrifying precision. A quiet corner of the forest during the prisoner transfer at dawn. A pretended stumble, a struggle, a single, point-blank shot from his Tokarev pistol. The report swallowed by the trees. The body falling. The story written, prisoner attempted escape, was neutralized. A clean close to an unclean chapter. No trial, no speeches, no chance for lies or excuses. Just the final, undeniable punctuation of a bullet. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk, his strides long and purposeful, carrying him away from the hostile buildings towards the dark line of the forest. He needed to move, to outpace the storm inside his skull. The images flashed, unbidden and crystalline. His father's hand on his shoulder, the feel of wool and pipe tobacco. Then the other image, the same hand, skeletal and gray, reaching from the pile of striped uniforms. Richter's polished boot tapping. Tap, tap. The sound echoed, morphing into the dry metallic click of his own pistol's hammer being cocked. He found himself at the edge of the woods, where the tidy grass gave way to wild ferns and shadow. He stopped, breathing heavily, though not from exertion. From his tunic pocket, he drew the object that was both a compass and a curse, the metal tag. 124565. He didn't need to look at it. He held it in his clenched fist, the sharp edges biting into the flesh of his palm, a familiar anchoring pain. He was prisoner 124565. That man's justice was simple. It was the justice of the claw, of the tooth, of surviving to see your tormentor broken. That man would walk into the dawn and pull the trigger without a second thought. He had earned that right in blood and ash. Then, from his other pocket, he drew the photograph. In the fading blue light, the faces were soft smudges of gray. Solomon, 13 years old. The boy who believed in books, in justice, in his father's gentle explanations of right and wrong. That boy's justice was different. It was the justice of a courtroom, of truth spoken aloud, of a world that acknowledged the crime. That boy would want the fox exposed, humiliated, made to answer before the world. Semyon stood on the border between the dark forest and the last of the daylight, a man torn in two by geography and time. He was both the prisoner and the boy. He was also Senior Sergeant Semyon Steinberg, a soldier of the Red Army that had just crushed the fascist beast. What did that man owe? To the past or to the future he was supposedly fighting for? The conflict was a physical agony, a twisting in his gut. He thought of the woman in the transit camp, of her hollow eyes. Her justice would not be a secret bullet. It would be a verdict, a record, proof. He heard a soft crunch of gravel behind him. He did not turn, but his whole body tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards the holster at his side. It was Petya. The young soldier approached cautiously, as one would approach a wounded, dangerous animal. He had seen Semyon leave the interrogation room. He had seen his face. "Comrade Sergeant?" Petya's voice was quiet, devoid of its usual naive energy. Semyon did not answer for a long moment. He slowly, deliberately, put the photograph and the tag back into his pockets, sealing the two halves of his soul away. "He was there, Petya," Semyon said finally, his voice raw, scraped hollow from the inside. "That man in the interrogation room. He was an overseer in the camp where I wore this." He gestured vaguely to his pocket. "He knew my father. He sent him to his death." Petya absorbed this, the horror dawning on his young face, not as a general horror of war, but as a specific, personal catastrophe happening to the man he respected most. What will you do?" Semyon turned to look at him then, and what Petya saw in his sergeant's eyes made him take an involuntary step back. It was not madness. It was a terrifying, absolute certainty. "He will be put on the transport to the collection point tomorrow at first light," Semyon stated, his voice now flat and tactical. "I will volunteer for the escort detail." He let the implication hang in the cool air. It was not a confession of intent. It was a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the metal tag in his pocket. He was outlining a mission. Petya opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to offer help, but no words came. He understood he was not looking at his sergeant anymore. Not entirely. He was looking at a force of nature, a long-delayed avalanche, finally set in motion. The law, the army, the war, they were all abstractions now. This was personal. This was primal. Semyon looked past Petya, back towards the hostel, where the single bulb in the interrogation room window still glowed. Inside that room, Karl Richter was sitting with his ghosts. And out here in the gathering dark, Semyon Steinberg was making a calculation. The equation of revenge was clear. He just had to decide which version of himself would be the one to solve it. He reached down and unbuttoned the stiff leather flap of his holster, his fingers checking the cold, solid weight of the Tokarev pistol within. A familiar comfort, a simple tool. The geometry of its purpose had never been clearer. Dawn arrived not with color, but with a slow leaching of gray into the black. A thick, cold mist had risen from the forest floor overnight, swallowing the lower halves of trees and transforming the world into a ghostly, monochrome labyrinth. It was perfect weather for ghosts, and Semyon felt like one of them. He had not slept. He had spent the night in a state of hyper-alert stillness, meticulously cleaning his weapons, the Tokarev pistol, the PPSH submachine gun, not out of necessity, but as a ritual, a meditation on the mechanics of violence. Each cleaned part, each oily rag, was a step closer to the moment. The geometric solution to his equation felt both abstract and intensely physical. At the motor pool, the scene was one of grim routine. A canvas-topped truck, its engine grumbling and spewing white vapor into the fog, stood ready. The prisoners from the hostel, about 15 of them,